English story. Pulling up seedings to help them grow. Once upon a time, in a quaint village nestled between rolling hills and the lush green fields, there lived a farmer named Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee was known throughout the village for his hardworking nature and his dedication to his rice paddies. However, Mr. Lee was also known for his impatience. One spring, after planting his rice seedlings, Mr. Lee was particularly anxious about his crop. The previous year had been challenging, with a drought that had severely impacted the yield. Determined to ensure a bountiful harvest, he inspected his fields daily, watching the tiny green shoots emerging from the waterlogged soil. One morning, while Mr. Lee was tending to his paddies, his neighbor, Mrs. Wang, called out to him. "Good morning, Mr. Lee. How are your seedlings coming along?" she asked, smiling warmly. "They are growing, but too slowly for my liking," Mr. Lee replied with a frown. "I worry that they won't mature in time for the harvest." Mrs. Wang, who had been farming for decades, chuckled softly. "Patience is a virtue, Mr. Lee. The seedlings will grow at their own pace. They need time to establish their roots." Despite Mrs. Wang's sage advice, Mr. Lee's anxiety only grew with each passing day. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something to speed up the growth of his seedlings. One afternoon, after a particularly restless night, an idea struck Mr. Lee. "If I help the seedlings a little, maybe they'll grow faster," he thought to himself. With newfound determination, he grabbed a bucket of water and a small spade and headed to his fields. Mr. Lee knelt beside the first row of seedlings and gently tugged at one of the shoots, pulling it upward. To his delight, the seedling stood taller, encouraged. He moved down the toe, pulling each seedling upward. By the time the sun began to set, Mr. Lee had worked through all the entire field. Feeling satisfied with his efforts, Mr. Lee returned home, confident that he had given his crop a much-needed boost. The next morning, Mr. Lee awoke with eager anticipation. He hurried to his fields, expecting to see a significant improvement. As he approached the paddies, his heart sank. The once vibrant green shoots now lay wilted and lifeless in the water. "What happened?" Mr. Lee exclaimed in disbelief. He dropped to his knees and examined the seedlings. Their roots had been disturbed, and they could no longer draw the necessary nutrients from the soil. In his haste to make them grow faster, he had inadvertently killed them. Just then, Mrs. Wang appeared at the edge of the field. She had seen Mr. Lee's action the previous day and had come to check on him. "Oh, Mr. Lee," she said, shaking her head sadly, "you cannot force growth. Each plant has its own time and rhythm. By trying to speed up the process, you have caused more harm than good." Mr. Lee felt a deep sense of regret. "I was so eager for a good harvest that I forgot the importance of patience and natural growth." Mrs. Wang placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It is a hard lesson, but an important one. Nature has his own pace, and we must respect it." Over the next few weeks, Mr. Lee replanted his fields, this time allowing the seedlings to grow undisturbed. He spent his days carefully tending to the paddies, ensuring they had enough water and were free from pests. He resisted the urge to interfere with their growth, remembering the painful lesson he had learned. As the weeks turned into months, Mr. Lee's patience was rewarded. The seedlings grew strong and healthy, their roots firmly established in the soil. By the time the harvest season arrived, his fields were a sea of golden rice plants, swaying gently in the breeze. One evening, as Mr. Lee stood at the edge of his fields, admiring the fruits of his labor, Mrs. Wang joined him. "You see, Mr. Lee," she said, smiling, "nature knows best. Sometimes, the best thing we can do is to step back and allow things to unfold in their own time." Mr. Lee nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Thank you, Mrs. Wang. I have learned a valuable lesson. Patience and respect for the natural process are essential for success." Mrs. Wang patted his back. "Indeed, Mr. Lee, and remember, this lesson applies not just to farming, but to many aspects of life, whether it's raising children, building a business, or pursuing personal growth. Rushing the process can lead to unintended consequences." As the sun set over the village, casting a warm glow over love fields. Mr. Li reflected on the wisdom of Mrs. Wang's words. He realized that his impatience had been driven by fear and a desire for control. By learning to let go and trust the natural process, he had not only salvaged his crop, but also gained a deeper understanding of life's rhythms. From that day forward, Mr. Li became known not just for his hard work, but also for his newfound wisdom and patience. He often shared his story with fellow villagers, reminding them of the importance of respecting nature's timeline.
Woo!
After listening several times, try your best to answer the following questions. 1. Why was Mr. Li anxious about his rice seedlings? Ans 1. Mr. Li was anxious because the previous year had been challenging due to a drought and he wanted to ensure a bountiful harvest this year. Q2. What did Mrs. Wang advise Mr. Li to do regarding his seedlings? Ans 2. Mrs. Wang advised Mr. Li to be patient and let the seedlings grow at their own pace, emphasizing that they needed time to establish their roots. Q3. What action did Mr. Li take to try and speed up the growth of his seedlings? Ans 3. Mr. Li decided to pull each seedling slightly upward, believing that it would help them grow faster. Q4. What was the result of Mr. Li's attempt to help his seedlings grow faster? Ans 4. The result was that the seedlings' roots were disturbed, and they wilted and died because they could no longer draw the necessary nutrients from the soil. Q5. What lesson did Mr. Li learn from his experience with the seedlings? Ans 5. Mr. Li learned that growth cannot be forced and that patience and respect for the natural process are essential. He realized the importance of allowing things to unfold in their own time. 1. Why did Mr. Li inspect his fields daily? A. He was looking for pests. B. He wanted to see if the soil needed more water. C. He was anxious about the slow growth of his seedlings. D. He enjoyed spending time in his fields. 2. What was Mrs. Wang's reaction to Mr. Li's concerns about his seedlings? A. She was worried. B. She laughed at him. C. She gave him advice. D. She ignored him. 3. What did Mr. Li use to try and help his seedlings grow faster? A. Fertilizer and water. B. A small space and a bucket of water. C. Extra sunlight. D. Special soil. 4. How did Mrs. Wang react when she saw what Mr. Li had done to his seedlings? A. She congratulated him. B. She warned him it was a mistake. C. She offered to help him fix the damage. D. She told him to plant new seeds. 5. What did Mr. Li do differently after learning his lesson? A. He hired someone to take care of his fields. B. He used special growth techniques. C. He allowed the seedlings to grow undisturbed and focused on proper care. D. He gave up on farming. You've finished all the questions. Don't forget to like and subscribe.